To start. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, thank you for coming. My name is Daniel Piccolo. I am from the University of Portsmouth, and I work in basically health and exercise physiology. I'm doing a PhD there. The title of my presentation is "The Use of Hot Tubs to Improve Older Adult Health." Just a little bit of background on me. The title of my PhD overall is "The Effects of Acute and Repeated Passive Heating on Cardiovascular, Cognitive, and Muscle Function in Healthy Older Adults." So when we say passive heating, that's essentially hot tubs. These are my PhD supervisors on here, and just a few pictures of me in the lab. Today, I'm just going to speak. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of background on the aging process and why I'm using hot tubs. We're going to go through my research study design and what we did, and then we'll look at the results, the findings, and then just a few take-home messages and conclusions. So first, though, how did I end up speaking here? Well, as you'll see later on, it was quite an endeavor for any of my participants to make it through my study intervention, and so we were struggling to get people to actually do it. So what we did was we put out a bit of a media release to try and coerce people into doing this, which we thought was going to be a local thing to our Portsmouth area. And then after that went out, woke up one morning, my wife turns to me, "Why is your friend Tom on the BBC News website?" And I thought, uh-oh, here we go. I looked at my emails, I had a few emails, and then all of a sudden the story blew up and we were published in, I don't know if you can see. There were articles all over the news. This one, like The Independent, so gigantic news outlets, was advertised on the radio, and then I ended up receiving over like 600 or 700 emails of people that were interested in participating in my study, which was quite an endeavor to answer all of those emails, but it showed that there is some appetite for using hot tubs. And with that, I ended up having a conversation with Chris Hayes, who is the director of the British and Irish Spa and Hot Tub Association, and through that, ended up getting some funding from them in order to help me with my research. And then in addition to the media coverage, I somehow ended up on a Channel 5 news program, which was pretty interesting, and I did a few radio interviews as well. So just a little background on the rationale for why we conducted this research. So when we talk about human aging, it's essentially over time, our bodies deteriorate, and Father Time is pretty much undefeated. All our cellular structures deteriorate. You can see basically what happens to our cardiovascular system, our arteries. They sort of thicken up and get stiffer, and then similar to our brain, we sort of lose brain matter over time, and we know that as we get older, our cognitive function usually declines, and then similar with our muscles, they go basically into less function as we get older. If you can see on the diagram, essentially here is a lot more of like fat tissue that's in the muscle rather than just pure muscle, which is on the left in a young, healthy individual. And basically that increases our risk of diseases and negative conditions. At the moment, basically everyone that's over 60, or half of people over 65, the age of 65, are usually carrying two or more comorbidities, which is essentially like a disease condition or some sort of health problem. So with that, we also have some interesting population trends that are happening globally. So the UN has come out with a recent forecast that by the end of this century, there will be roughly 2 billion people in the world that are age 65 or over, and that is the purple line on that left graph, and the red and the green one that are below that is actually young people. So we're going to have a lot more older people by the end of this century than we are younger people. So, and we also know that older adults are generally less active. So we know that exercise and physical activity participation decreases, and then it drastically decreases as we get over the age of 75. And in the scientific community, for exercise, we always say exercise is medicine, and usually we have lots of evidence to say that it is, and in some cases better than pharmaceutical drugs, but people don't want to do it. So what is the alternative? Could it be hot tubs? So why would hot tubs be like doing exercise? I'm just going to go through a few things that happen when you go into a hot tub. So essentially, similar to exercise, we raise our body temperature as we go into the hot water. That causes our heart rate to increase, because actually what we want to do is we want to bring that body temperature back down to normal. And with that, we get large increases in blood flow. And so we get lots of blood flow going around our body. And when we get really hot in the hot tub, it goes to our peripheries. So we get lots of increases around to our skin, and that makes us sweat. And with that, what we get is a relaxation of our blood vessels. So essentially, if you think a blood vessel that has high blood pressure, so we know that high blood pressure is bad, that would be a really stiff blood vessel. But if we have low blood pressure and we're relaxed, that would be a very nice blood vessel, and we would call that dilation. So we think that if we go and put people in a hot water environment, and we do that repeatedly, that this could have chronic health benefits. So that was sort of the basis for conducting my research. I don't know if essentially, this is just a select few studies. There's quite a lot of studies that have been done in sort of this hot tub area, but the first and the third one are some good, strong evidence, and that's been backed up quite heavily, that going to hot tubs can improve our cardiovascular function. And then there's also evidence that it could improve our cognitive function as well as muscles function as well on the bottom. All right, so however, a lot of this research has focused on young people, because most research is conducted in a university environment, and you have readily available university students at your whim to do whatever you want to them. Whereas recruiting people from harder to reach areas, and usually from the community or from certain clinical populations, is a much more arduous endeavor, as I found out when I started my PhD. So there's a lack of research that's in older people, and actually, in my opinion, this is more applicable to people that are less likely to do exercise than young people. So what I did was I got my participants, and what they did is they came in, we screened them, we did some baseline testing at the start. So we tested their resting cardiovascular function, their basic muscle function, and some stuff in their blood. Then they were randomized, and by the arrows on the left, you can see they either did a period of 6 weeks where they went into the hot tub 3 times a week, and that was, each hot tub session was 60 minutes, so 1 hour, and the temperature of the water was 40 degrees. And as you'll see in some subsequent data, we did cook them quite well. And if they didn't do the hot tubs, they did a control period where they essentially just maintained their daily routine, and that was for 6 weeks. So these were both 6-week time periods. Then we tested them at the end, the same tests we did at the start, and then of the end of that 6-week period, then they did what's called a crossover, and they had a 6-week period called a which is a washout, and that's essentially, so for the people that did the hot tubs, we want the effects of that, the potential effects of that to wear off within the 6-week period, and then they started up again doing the opposite part of the study that they hadn't done. So the people that did the control, they did the hot tubs second, and then the people that did the hot tubs first, they did the control, where they did basically maintain their daily routine. And then we tested them at the beginning and end of those periods as well. So it was quite an arduous endeavor, as you can see in the bottom right. So these people came to the lab at least 20-ish times, so very time-consuming for them. And then to top it off, I challenged myself to essentially when they did their very first hot tub, I was testing the effects of just what happens to these people when they go through one single hot tub exposure. So that's what happens when they do 60 minutes, and then I tested a bunch of stuff and how it changed over time for 3 days. So this is just a little bit of a schedule of what that day looked like. So we tested them in the first thing in the morning, then they went into the hot tub, and we were testing for their cognitive, how being in the hot tub for 60 minutes changed their cognitive function and their vascular function, as well as a lot of stuff in the blood. So I was taking lots and lots of blood samples from these people, and then we tested their cardiovascular and cognitive function at various intervals for one long day, and then we tested them again 1 day later and 2 days later. And as you can see on the right, it wasn't a traditional hot tub setting for most of it. We have fancy immersion pool facilities in our lab, and for safety purposes, we had them on a controllable sling so that I could control how much they were in the water. So what's next? So just a little bit of specifics on stuff that we tested for. So as I mentioned, cardiovascular function. So I did a lot of like ultrasound scans on their arteries to see how those functioned. We took a bunch of blood pressure readings. We also looked at blood vessels that are smaller, which are in your forearm, and how they responded to an infusion of drugs. We tested their cognitive function. So these were tests of memory, logic, and reaction time, as well as a fancy device that we put on their forehead that gives us a sort of surrogate measure of how much blood is going through their brain. I had them do tests of strength in their legs and grip strength, and then we had fancy cameras that basically watched how they walked around and did some functional tasks, like walking in a line, a balance, or standing up and sitting down from a chair, which are meant to represent normal daily activities that people do. And then a lot of my life has been spent handling blood samples over the past couple years. So I took a lot of blood from these people, and you're testing for different proteins that show up in the blood and how they change. So that's what we're interested in. And I should mention that while everyone was in the hot tub, in a laboratory study, we have to make sure that we're maintaining safety. So in addition to all these lab visits, all the people had to commit to wearing a thermistor in their rectum. So they had to insert that themselves every time that they went in. So that was another hurdle to get over to convince people to participate in my research. So just going to give you a little bit of data on the participants that did it. So we had a few more people that did just the short version of the study, but generally speaking, the average age was in the upper 60s. I'm not getting I can't get this to work. If you look at the bottom left, essentially, we raised their temperature each session by basically 1.5 to 2 degrees. So normal body temperature starts around 36.5 to 37 degrees, and we were really cooking them each time to raise their body temperature between 38.5 and 39. And we think that that range of temperature is where we get some cool things happening in our blood with all these proteins that we were looking at. So for the results that we found, I'll just go through what happened when they went through one hot tub session first. So on the upper left, these are some blood pressure readings. So actually, what we found is that there were no changes in blood pressure, which was an interesting finding. So that was over 3 days. The main things that we actually found, so this is for cardiovascular function, is that a few hours after the hot tub, their cardiovascular function was actually impaired, and I guess it kind of makes a little bit sense that we really stressed their bodies. But essentially their blood vessels didn't dilate as well in response to the stimulus that we put in. But that did go back to where they started at a couple days later. So the stress effects of it from a cardiovascular point of view did essentially wear off. So there is that. In regards to cognitive function, just quickly what people had to do. So it was a test on a computer, and they had to do a reaction time test where they basically saw something on the screen and had to click based on what it was. They had a logical test where they had to say where something was true or false, and then there were 2 levels of a memory test where they had to remember one number back, and then they had to remember 2 numbers back. And the 2 numbers back is fairly hard. Everyone hated it. But we tested so they did a round of these cognitive tests when they started, and then right after they got out of the water, so they were really hot when they did that, then a few hours later, and then we tested to see if it was back to where they started a day and 2 days later. And these were some interesting findings. So if you remember, I told you that we had a thing on their head that was sort of looking at like their blood flow and how it essentially looks at like how much oxygen is attached to our blood, and what we saw is that in these graphs here, that went down, so they were really stressed in terms of their blood, so they had to use a lot of oxygen in their blood in order to try and, cool down and stave off this temperature increase. But their cognitive function on the left graph wasn't actually impaired despite this negative sort of cardiovascular response that we saw. And in fact, we actually saw that their reaction time and memory made some improvements in response to the hot tub. So it's quite a disjointed finding, not with what we were expecting to see. But everything pretty much was the same a couple days later, except their reaction time was actually still elevated, which was a good finding. And we'll see that this thread is maintained through the results of doing it a lot of times. And I did all that testing in the blood, and actually, in response to the hot tub, we saw nothing different. So these were markers that usually imply like inflammation, and usually inflammation is bad. We don't want there to be, staying inflammation. But none of these markers in the blood that we tested actually were changed after the hot tub, which was quite a surprising finding. So then we get to the longer term. So this is doing the full 6 weeks of hot tubs 3 times a week. So we actually saw no changes. So this is like a sort of a chronic, an adaptation to our blood vessels. We saw no changes in their blood vessel function. So that's either main things we were looking at were the brachial artery, how that functions, as well as little smaller blood vessels in the forearm. There were no cardiovascular adaptations, which is really quite different to some of the other research that has gone on, particularly in young, healthy people. I have a semi-theory why that is. We also saw no changes in blood pressure, so their blood pressure wasn't really affected. The main thing that we did see was actually that at rest, their resting heart rate went down, which is a good thing. So that is a good finding. So we know that the sorry, in context, the one on the top left is the heart rate, and then the two on the right are essentially displaying like how much blood we're pumping around. So the fact that those didn't change, so we know that the heart was beating less times per minute, but pumping around the same total amount of blood. And so that is a good thing for us. We want to be pumping as much blood really per heartbeat every time that we do. So that was a positive finding. Similar, this is for stuff in the blood again. So similar to the one hot tub, as we would expect, if it didn't change when we did one hot tub, it's probably not going to have any effect on the stuff in the blood. Similar if we do it a lot of times. And these are, again, the same markers of inflammation and sort of response to heat that we looked at. The main interesting findings really were again related to cognitive function in response to the heating. So this was a little bit of a difference in terms of the way we conducted this study. Essentially, we did the cognitive function test the very first time they did a hot tub, and then we sort of replicated that the last time they did the hot tub. So the theory was originally that they were going to go into the hot tub and their cognitive performance was going to get worse because they were really hot. But after they went into the hot tub repeatedly over 6 weeks, that if we tested them at the end of it, that when they got out of the hot tub, they would be less bad or not really affected because they'd be more sort of acclimated to the hot environment, so it wouldn't be as much of a problem for them. And we tested the same things that we did. So they did these cognitive tests just right before the hot tub, then after the hot tub, and then a few hours later. And actually, what we found was that from a longer-term perspective, that actually their function in memory and logic was actually improved. And this is more of a sort of overall effect that we saw. So basically, we think that doing the hot tubs repeatedly actually improved their like baseline cognitive function that we saw. And if you remember, I was talking about the response to the sort of brain stuff that we were doing with the brain blood flow. Actually, what we thought was that would get worse the first time, and then it would be as similar to the cognitive performance, that it would be sort of less affected, and because they were more used to all the hot tubs. But actually, it was the exact same. So despite the, oxygenation, so we call that cerebral oxygenation, essentially how much oxygen was like in the blood up here, they still improved their cognitive function, even though they were quite stressed by the hot tub. So it's a very weird finding. So our method that we used to measure that was a real more simple, non-invasive way. So you would kind of need to look at more complex ways of looking at it. So you could use like a PET scan or an MRI scanner to get a better image of what's really going on. But we do know that as we get older, so remember I showed the diagram of the brain, so we lose like brain matter, but actually our bodies are really good at finding some sort of compensatory mechanisms, and so we can despite some shortcomings in other places, the brain is able to activate and work in ways that it needs to. So we think something like that might be going on, but we didn't really test for that, and we don't have all the fancy instruments needed where we are. And there were some interesting findings. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about our findings with muscle. So there were some interesting potential findings on these. So in terms of strength, we actually saw no differences in that. So people's leg and grip strength, it didn't change in response to that, in response to the hot tubs. But what we did see was when we put people through our, we call it's essentially like a functional performance battery. So it's 3 parts. You have a balance test, then you walk in a straight line a certain distance, and then you're sitting on a chair and you try and stand up and sit back down 5 times as fast as you possibly can. And actually what we found was that we had these like special cameras where we watched how people moved. We actually found that the power, so that like the knee joint was actually potentially going up, and despite, so these results on the top, they're not statistically significant, which is usually our barometer for whether something had an effect, but the participants got a lot better after the hot tubs versus the control in terms of a actual score when they did the sit to stand test, and that sort of resulted. They essentially did the 5 sit to stands a full second faster, and that ended up resulting in the total score of the entire functional battery that they did being better. But again, it wasn't like a statistical change that we saw. However, this wasn't the main thing we were testing, so we can't necessarily say that it was the case, but it does seem to look like that. And in terms of the actual knee power, so power is essentially how fast you can move something, and it translates to doing like normal activities around the house, or going upstairs, or getting up out of a chair and doing something like that. So the yellow line on there went while they did all the hot tubs, and then the blue line is when they did nothing, or the control period, as we would say. So actually we saw a little bit, it went down during the period of nothing, and then it was actually going up while they did, or after all the hot tub sessions. So those are the main results, and as you can definitely see, my participants put in a lot of work and a lot of time for me, and I'm very grateful. So I'll just go through a few take-home messages and conclusions. So what I found was, in the healthy older adults that we had, I should say that the minimum age was 55. I forgot to say that, but they ranged from sort of upper 50s to early 80s. But we didn't find that it really had an effect on their cardiovascular function, which is a little bit of a surprising finding. We found that it did improve measures of their cognitive performance, specifically acutely reaction time, and then for a longer term, their logic and their memory was improved. So it showed, as I just said, some potential for improvements in muscle power, which translates to doing sort of activities of daily living, as we would call them. And then it had no effect on anything that we tested in the blood, which was related to heat stress and inflammation, which I'm quite sad about. And as with scientific research, it's always you try and answer some questions, and then for every question that you might have a potential answer for, that opens up 10 more questions that need to be done, because you don't have unlimited resources to run sort of a perfect laboratory study. There's always things missing. So based off what I found, potentially we need to go longer than 6 weeks and potentially more than 3 hot tubs a week. One of the things that I think is, I've said in the last slide that we need to look at clinical populations. I think that based on what I found in the blood, a lot of the people that I tested were quite different. We didn't do any sort of tests before them for what their levels of different markers in the blood were. So I think this might be something that's better on a study group that is a lot more similar, that we know is more similar, so that we can isolate the effects of what is happening quite a lot better. Because some of these figures, they have individual data points on them, but they're quite widespread. So that just shows you that different people had a lot of different starting levels, and usually with that limits your ability to notice any statistical changes, because the data is all like really wide ranging, so it can be hard to compare between them. And then just to follow up on my somewhat strange findings with improvements in cognitive function, some more targeted, fancy, mechanistic work to figure out what's really going on, why these older people that I had actually improved when some other markers of their function actually said that they should have been worse. And then just as a follow-up at what I'm doing now, we've got a couple of papers. These are some manuscripts that are going into a scientific journal, and at the moment they're currently under review. These are looking at the effects of cognitive function and muscle function. Hopefully they'll be published soon. And thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Chris Hayes and Bishta and SPATEX for letting me come and present my findings, and for funding some of my work over the last year or so. And as I've said before, thanks to all my participants, and this was not just me. I had a lot of help from colleagues and lab helpers. So thank you very much for listening.